June 25th, 2025. 16 years since the world was told the king of pop had died. And still, right now, in comment sections and forums and group chats at 2 a.m., someone is typing the same 6 words. I don't think he's really dead. Not one person, not 100. Millions. 16 years of funerals, tributes, documentaries, and court cases. 16 years of his own children growing up without him. And still, an entire slice of the internet refuses to accept the ending everyone else already grieved. So the question is not whether Michael Jackson died. Medically, legally, officially, he did. The real question is stranger. Why do so many people, after 16 years, still refuse to believe it? And once you start pulling that thread, you understand why. June 25th, 2009, early afternoon in Los Angeles. TMZ posts 4 words. Michael Jackson has died. For 11 minutes, nothing official confirms it. No hospital statement, no police statement, no family statement. Just a gossip website and a planet holding its breath. Then it spreads. Twitter goes down. Wikipedia's servers choke under the load. Google, for a few minutes, thinks it's under attack because too many people are searching the same 3 words at once. By nightfall, news vans surround UCLA Medical Center. Fans sit on the pavement outside Neverland. Radio stations across the world drop their programming and just play his songs one after another, like a wake broadcast live. And in the middle of that chaos, something quieter is happening. People are already asking questions nobody has answers to yet. Why did it take so long to confirm? Why was the story breaking on a gossip site before it broke anywhere official? And why, in the grainy paparazzi footage of an ambulance leaving the house on Carrollwood Drive, does something about the shape of the face inside look wrong? That last question would not go away. It would grow into an entire subculture. The paramedics load a body into the ambulance. Cameras are already there because paparazzi had been camped outside Jackson's rented mansion for weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of story. The footage is shaky. The angle is bad. But it is the only visual record most of the public would ever get of Michael Jackson's body. Within hours, frame-by-frame breakdowns appear online. Amateur forensic analysts, some real, most just obsessive fans with too much time and too much grief, start measuring things. The jawline looks too square. The hairline sits differently. The ears, they say, don't match decades of red carpet photos. None of this holds up to actual forensic scrutiny. Paramedics move quickly. Sheets shift. Lighting from a dozen flashing cameras distorts everything. Every professional who has looked at the footage says the same thing. This is what a stretcher transfer looks like. Not evidence of a body double. But by the time that explanation exists, the theory has already gone viral. And once a theory goes viral before the correction does, the correction almost never catches up. This is the first rule of every Michael Jackson conspiracy that follows. The ambiguous image always travels faster than the boring explanation. 2 funerals happen, a quiet private burial, and a massive public memorial at the Staples Center, watched by roughly 1 billion people worldwide. At that memorial sits a solid gold-plated coffin, custom-built, reportedly weighing hundreds of pounds even before anything was placed inside it, and it never opens. The family stands beside it. Fans weep in front of it. The world watches it for 2.5 hours. But nobody, at any point, on camera, sees what's inside. For most people, that's simply what closed casket funerals are. Private grief, kept private, especially for a family already torn apart by decades of tabloid intrusion. But for a small, determined slice of the audience, an unopened coffin is not privacy. It's an opportunity. If no one saw the body, no one can prove there was a body at all. And once that idea takes root, every unanswered question about the days that followed starts to look less like coincidence and more like a pattern. An autopsy is performed the day after his death. A second independent autopsy is requested by the family shortly after. 2 different medical teams, 2 different rooms, examining the same body within days of each other. Officially, both autopsies broadly agree: acute propofol intoxication, with a cocktail of sedatives contributing. Cause of death, homicide, due to the actions of another person. But the details leaking out of those autopsy rooms are what fuel the theories. Reports place his body weight startlingly low, some estimates hovering close to 50 kilograms for a man over 6 feet tall. Reports describe a body already showing signs consistent with long-term illness that had nothing to do with the events of that final night. To most doctors, this paints a tragic but coherent picture. A man in visibly declining health, propped up by medication just to function. To the theorists, it paints something else entirely. If the body was that fragile, that unrecognizable from the icon on stage weeks earlier, how can anyone be sure whose body it actually was? The gap between "this makes medical sense" and "this feels impossible to believe" is exactly where these theories live. Here's where the story stops being about a body and starts being about a man. Conrad Murray, Michael Jackson's personal physician, hired at a reported $150,000 a month specifically to accompany him through the grueling rehearsal schedule for his comeback tour. On the morning of June 25th, Murray is alone with Jackson in the bedroom. Jackson has been struggling to sleep for weeks. Murray has been administering a rotating cocktail of sedatives almost nightly, culminating that morning in a dose of propofol, a surgical anesthetic that has no business being used outside a hospital, let alone as a sleep aid in a private bedroom. At some point, Jackson stops breathing. Murray does not call 911. He calls the house security staff first. Precious minutes pass before emergency services are actually contacted. By the time paramedics arrive, they are, in the professional opinion of multiple experts who later testified, arriving too late to matter. Murray would eventually be convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He served 2 years of a 4-year sentence. For the general public, this closes the case. A reckless doctor, chasing a paycheck, killed his patient through catastrophic negligence. For the conspiracy community, this is where the real questions start. Because negligence this severe, delay this strange, decisions this careless, they don't read like an accident to everyone. To some, they read like the opening moves of a cover story. Before June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson's finances were a well-documented disaster. Reports placed his debts somewhere north of $400 million. Neverland Ranch had already been used as collateral. Lawsuits from a decade of tabloid trials had drained him. The comeback tour, This Is It, 50 sold-out shows at London's O2 Arena, was widely reported as his last realistic chance to climb out of that hole. Then he dies. And within 18 months, his estate is not just solvent, it's thriving. The This Is It documentary, assembled from rehearsal footage shot in his final weeks, becomes one of the highest-grossing concert films of all time. Album sales spike overnight, the way they always do after a major artist's death, but at a scale few predicted. New recording deals, a Cirque du Soleil residency, licensing agreements, deal after deal gets signed by an estate that, by some estimates, would go on to earn more in the decade after his death than he earned in the final decade of his life. To an accountant, this is a tragic but familiar story. The market reevaluating an artist's catalog after death, the same pattern seen with Elvis, with Prince, with Whitney Houston. To a conspiracy theorist, it's something colder. A financial collapse solved instantly and permanently by the one event that made every debt renegotiable and every asset suddenly, dramatically more valuable. Nobody has ever produced evidence that this timing was engineered. But the timing itself, the immediate, dramatic reversal of a man's fortunes at the exact moment he stopped needing money to live, is the kind of detail a true crime audiences can't let go of. If you've made it this far and you're the kind of person who reads court documents for fun, drop a comment with which theory you think holds up. Because it only gets stranger from here. 2 months after the death, Larry King's show airs a segment that, to this day, gets re-uploaded every few years with a fresh wave of views. A man with severe facial burns sits across from King. He's introduced as a fan, someone whose life story intersected with Jackson's in the past. His name, according to the show, is Dave, but something about the segment unsettles people watching. The voice, the mannerisms, the specific, almost rehearsed way he speaks about Jackson's death, calm in a way that feels out of step with the raw grief everyone else in his position seemed to carry. Clips of the segment circulate for years, captioned with a single unsettling question. What if the man behind those burns was never who the show said he was? There is no credible evidence supporting that claim. Dave's identity and history are independently documented outside that one broadcast. But the segment's strange, uncanny energy was enough to plant a seed that a certain corner of the internet has never fully let go of. The idea that Jackson himself could have appeared, disguised, commenting on his own supposed death in real time, it's one of the most far-fetched theories in the entire catalog. It's also, according to view counts on the re-uploads, one of the most watched. Fast forward to 2014. Sony and the estate release Escape, a posthumous album built from unfinished Jackson recordings, reworked and produced after his death. 2 years earlier, in 2010, a similar posthumous album called Michael had already caused a firestorm, because 3 of its tracks, known as the Casio tracks, were flagged by fans, musicians, and even some family members as not actually being Michael Jackson's voice at all. Reggie Jackson, his nephew, publicly questioned the vocals. A fan-led lawsuit followed, alleging the tracks were performed by a sound-alike. The case dragged through courts for years before eventually being dismissed, but the label and estate never definitively proved, to the satisfaction of every listener, that it was really him singing. Think about what that means for a moment. A significant legal and cultural dispute existed over whether a voice on a posthumous Michael Jackson album actually belonged to Michael Jackson. It is also, for a specific slice of the internet, deeply unsettling in a way nobody quite expected. Because the movements were too fluid, the performance too natural, and almost immediately, comment sections filled with a single recurring joke that slowly stopped sounding like a joke to some people. What if it isn't a hologram at all? What if this is how he comes back? Obviously, it was a hologram. The production company behind it has documented publicly available records of exactly how it was built. but the emotional effect of watching a dead performer move, that convincingly live on a stage in front of a screaming crowd. It did something to the collective psyche that no amount of technical explanation could fully undo. Grief plus uncanny technology is a combustible mix. And in 2014, that mix went off in front of a global television audience. If a family is united in grief, conspiracy theories struggle to find oxygen. If a family keeps sending mixed signals for over a decade, the theories practically write themselves. Over the years, members of the Jackson family have said things, publicly, on record, that sound almost designed to fuel doubt, even when that was never the intention. LaToya Jackson, in interviews years after the death, made comments questioning aspects of the circumstances surrounding her brother's passing before later walking parts of it back. Jermaine Jackson has spoken, at different points, about believing the full truth of what happened that day has never fully come out. And decades earlier, long before 2009, Michael Jackson himself had already given the public a real, well-documented precedent for exactly this kind of doubt. Because in 2005, during his acquittal on other charges, he quietly relocated to Bahrain under an arrangement involving a different public identity, living out of the spotlight for a stretch of time before eventually returning. That's not a rumor, that's documented history. Michael Jackson had, once before, disappeared from public life and reemerged under different circumstances. So when family members hint, even vaguely, that something doesn't add up, the audience doesn't hear vague grief. They hear confirmation of a pattern they already believed was possible. In his final weeks, cameras were rolling almost constantly, capturing rehearsal footage for This Is It. Hundreds of hours of it. Much of that footage would later be cut into the documentary, but far more of it exists in the raw, unedited archive than the public has ever seen in full. Fans who studied the released footage frame by frame started noticing what they describe as inconsistencies, a slightly different gait in some clips, subtle shifts in vocal tone between songs recorded on the same reported day, moments where lighting or wardrobe details seem to contradict the timeline production staff gave. Film editors and forensic video analysts who've reviewed similar claims generally point to a much simpler explanation. Rehearsal footage shot across weeks under inconsistent lighting with a performer who was visibly exhausted and inconsistent night to night is going to look inconsistent. That's what real, unpolished production footage looks like. But inconsistent because reality is messy is a much less satisfying answer than inconsistent because something was being hidden. And in the attention economy of true crime YouTube, the less satisfying answer rarely wins the algorithm. Here's a detail most casual fans never learn because it doesn't fit neatly into a 2-minute news segment. After the public memorial, Michael Jackson's body wasn't actually buried right away. For nearly 2 months, it sat in a vault at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, while the family reportedly debated where his final resting place should be, and while a custom mausoleum was prepared to hold him. 2 months, no headstone, no public burial. No confirmation ceremony that most fans could point to and say, that's the moment it became real. Cemetery officials have explained this kind of delay is not unusual for high-profile burials, where security concerns and construction timelines often push interment back by weeks or months. Elvis Presley's own burial was delayed and even relocated once for almost identical reasons: crowd control and permanent security planning. But explain that to a fan base already primed by an unopened coffin and a body they never saw. To them, a 2-month gap between he died and he was actually placed in the ground isn't bureaucracy. It's a window wide enough, in their minds, for anything to have happened. Every conspiracy eventually finds its numerologist, and Michael Jackson's death is no exception. He died on June 25th, 625. Fans point out that 625 appears, depending on how you squint, in various numeric patterns tied to his career. Album release dates, chart positions, even the exact runtime of certain music videos, if you're willing to round generously enough. His stage name initials, MJ, get mapped onto everything from flight numbers referenced in unrelated news stories to license plates spotted in random paparazzi photos of his children years later. None of this holds up to even basic scrutiny. Human brains are pattern-matching machines, and given a large enough pool of numbers connected to a famous person's life, you will always be able to find coincidences if you go looking hard enough. This is the exact same phenomenon that fuels Tupac numerology theories, JFK numerology theories, and virtually every major conspiracy built around a beloved public figure's death. But numerology isn't really about math. It's about pattern as reassurance. If the universe left a code, then the death wasn't random, wasn't senseless, wasn't just a preventable tragedy caused by greed and negligence. It was part of something bigger. For some fans, that idea is easier to sit with than the alternative. Perhaps the cruelest layer of this entire story is what it did to the 3 children Michael Jackson left behind. Paris Jackson, his daughter, has spoken publicly more than once about growing up online in a world where strangers genuinely believed her father was still alive somewhere and that she was in on the secret. In interviews years after his death, she's described the emotional toll of having to repeatedly, publicly confirm, as a teenager, to an audience she never asked for, that yes, her father is dead, and no, there is no hidden truth she's protecting. Prince Jackson has, at points, made similar public statements, describing the strangeness of watching people online debate the reality of his own father's death as if it were an open case rather than a settled, documented, deeply personal loss his family has had to live inside every single day since. For most conspiracy theories, the subject is a stranger, an abstraction, a face on a screen. This one has living children who had to grow up answering strangers' doubts about whether their father's body was really in that golden coffin. That's a detail worth sitting with before going any further down the rabbit hole. Step back for a second, because there's a pattern underneath every single fact so far, and it's worth naming directly. None of these 13 individual pieces of evidence, on their own, would convince a courtroom of anything. A blurry ambulance photo, a closed coffin, a disputed vocal track, a hologram that felt too real. Each one, alone, is explainable. But conspiracy belief was never built one fact at a time. It's built by stacking. Stack a blurry photo on top of an unopened coffin. Stack that on top of a doctor who didn't call 911 fast enough. Stack that on top of a fortune that solved itself overnight. Stack that on top of a family that can't agree on the story. By the time you reach the 12th or 13th item, no single piece of evidence has to be strong, because the sheer volume feels like proof all on its own. Psychologists call this conjunction fallacy thinking. The tendency to believe that a longer, more detailed, more specific story feels more true than a short, boring one, even when the short, boring one is statistically far more likely to be correct. He died from a preventable medical accident caused by financial desperation, and a reckless doctor is short, boring, sad in an ordinary way. He faked his death to escape $400 million in debt, using a body double, a bribed doctor, and a decade-long cover story involving his own family is long, detailed. It has a villain, a hero, and a twist. It's simply a better story. And humans, grieving humans especially, have always preferred a better story to a sadder truth. Michael Jackson isn't the first icon whose death the public refused to fully accept. He's just the most recent chapter in a much older pattern. Elvis Presley died in 1977, and within days, Elvis sightings became a genuine cultural phenomenon. Grocery stores, gas stations, diners, decades of reported encounters that never stopped, even as the man would now be in his 90s. Tupac Shakur died in 1996. And to this day, an entire subculture insists he's alive somewhere, pointing to numerology in his lyrics, inconsistencies in the shooting investigation, and his own posthumous album titles as coded confirmation. Elvis and Tupac share three things with Michael Jackson: sudden, unexpected deaths, enormous devoted global fan bases who felt a deeply personal, parasocial connection to them, and financial or legal chaos surrounding them at the exact moment they died. That combination, beloved icon, sudden death, messy circumstances, appears to be the exact recipe that produces still-alive conspiracy theories, almost every single time it occurs. It happened with Elvis, it happened with Tupac, it happened with Michael Jackson. It will almost certainly happen again with someone else, someday, because the pattern isn't really about the individual, it's about what massive, sudden grief does to a fan base that isn't ready to let go. There's a fourth name worth mentioning too, one people forget belongs on this list. Andy Kaufman, the comedian, died in 1984 of a rare form of cancer at just 35 years old, because his entire career had been built on elaborate hoaxes, staged feuds, and characters designed to blur the line between performance and reality. A significant portion of his fan base simply refused to accept the death as real. Decades later, people still occasionally claim to have spotted him. His own family has had to publicly, repeatedly confirm that no, this was not one final bit. Notice what Kaufman, Elvis, Tupac, and Jackson all share beyond fame and sudden death. Each of them had, at some earlier point in their real, documented lives, already blurred the line between public persona and private reality. Kaufman built a career on hoaxes. Elvis was famously reclusive and secretive in his final years. Tupac had faked details about his own biography before. And Jackson, as established, had already disappeared from public life once before, resurfacing under different circumstances in Bahrain. In every single case, the audience already had a documented reason to believe this particular person was capable of disappearing and reappearing. The conspiracy theory isn't built from nothing. It's built from a kernel of real, verifiable behavior, stretched far past what the evidence can actually support. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important part of the entire story. Believing Michael Jackson is still alive isn't really about evidence. For most people who hold on to that belief, it was never about evidence in the first place. It's about control. Grief, real grief, especially for someone the world watched grow up on camera from the age of 5, is chaotic and formless and impossible to negotiate with. A conspiracy theory, by contrast, is something you can research, something you can debate, something with rules, clues, and a possible resolution. For a grieving fan, believing he might still be alive isn't dishonesty. It's a coping mechanism dressed up as an investigation. As long as the case stays open, the loss stays negotiable. As long as there's one more clip to analyze, one more coffin photo to zoom into, the finality of that June afternoon in 2009 can be kept just barely at arm's length. Add to that a documented, well-earned public distrust of the institutions involved. A doctor who got 2 years for a man's death, a family that fought publicly over money and custody, a media industry that had spent decades profiting off distorting Michael Jackson's image while he was alive. And you have the perfect conditions for disbelief to take root and never fully go away. There's also a darker, more uncomfortable layer underneath all of this, one that researchers who study parasocial relationships have written about at length. Fans who grew up with Michael Jackson's music soundtracking their entire lives didn't just lose an artist in 2009, they lost a piece of their own personal timeline. The person whose voice was playing at their first school dance, their parents' wedding, their childhood bedroom. Grieving a celebrity you never met can, psychologically, activate many of the same neural pathways as grieving someone you actually knew. The loss feels disproportionate to the relationship, because parasocial bonds don't obey the normal rules of intimacy. And when a loss feels that disproportionate, the mind looks for an explanation that matches the size of the feeling. A great man died of ordinary causes doesn't feel big enough to explain the hole it left. A great man's death was staged, hidden, or engineered by powerful people does. It's not that the theory is more believable, it's that it's more emotionally proportionate. This is, in a strange way, a kind of tribute hiding inside a conspiracy theory. The refusal to accept his death is, underneath all the coffin photos and ear measurements, a refusal to accept that someone who felt larger than life could be taken by something as mundane and preventable as a bad doctor and a bottle of anesthetic. 16 years later, none of this has faded. If anything, streaming culture has given it new life. TikTok compilations of the ambulance footage regularly cross into the millions of views, tagged with captions like, "You decide." Reddit threads analyzing the Casio track lawsuit still get revived every time a new posthumous release drops. YouTube's true crime ecosystem, the exact kind of channel producing the video you're watching right now, treats this case as one of its most reliable evergreen sources of engagement, because the questions never fully close. Conrad Murray has, in interviews since his release, maintained his own account of that morning, consistent with the version that sent him to prison. The Jackson estate has, over the years, continued releasing posthumous material, continued fighting lawsuits, continued growing an empire built on a catalog its owner never got to see fully monetized. And the fans? The fans are still zooming in on that ambulance photo, still measuring the years, still asking, in comment sections at 2 a.m., the same question that started 16 years ago. In 2019, 10 years after the death, the documentary Leaving Neverland reignited the entire conversation, but from an angle almost nobody expected. Not is he alive, but a fresh set of allegations about his life before June 25th, 2009. The timing mattered. It meant an entire new generation discovered the death conspiracy theories at the exact same moment they were discovering a completely separate, far more serious set of claims about the years before it. The two conversations got tangled together online, each one lending the other a strange borrowed urgency it didn't necessarily deserve on its own. Then, in 2025, 16 years out, the anniversary cycle repeats itself the way it does every year. News outlets run retrospectives, fan accounts post tribute edits set to man in the mirror, and somewhere in the replies, without fail, someone posts the ambulance photo again, cropped tighter than ever, captioned with a single question mark. The algorithm rewards it every time. Engagement doesn't care whether a claim is true. It cares whether a claim makes someone stop scrolling long enough to type a reply. He's still alive, stops the scroll. He died of a preventable overdose caused by financial desperation, does not, no matter how true it is. That, as much as any single piece of evidence in this entire video, might be the real engine keeping this theory alive in 2025. Not new information, not a fresh discovery. Just an algorithm, 16 years running, that has learned exactly which version of this story people can't resist clicking on. So, why don't people believe Michael Jackson is dead? Not because the evidence points that way. Every credible investigation, every autopsy, every court proceeding, every documented financial record converges on the same tragic, ordinary conclusion. A man in declining health, drowning in debt, pushed back onto a stage he wasn't ready for, was failed by the one person paid specifically to protect him. People don't believe it because belief was never really the point. The theories are a container for something much harder to hold. A grief so large, for a figure so mythologized, that an entire generation would rather chase an impossible story than sit with an unbearably simple one. Michael Jackson spent his entire life being turned into a symbol before anyone let him just be a person. Even in death, that hasn't stopped. Maybe it never will. But whatever you believe happened on June 25th, 2009, the coffin, the hologram, the disputed vocals, the man named Dave, none of it changes what he actually left behind. Thriller, Billie Jean, Man in the Mirror, a body of work that outgrew the man who made it a long time before he died. He gave the world everything he had while he was alive, and it seems the world still isn't ready to stop asking for more. Maybe that's the truest thing this entire story has to say. Not about Michael Jackson, but about everyone still zooming into that ambulance photo 16 years later. A conspiracy theory, in the end, is just grief that hasn't found anywhere else to go. It's a way of staying in the room a little longer, of keeping the conversation open, of refusing to let the credits roll on someone who felt like they belonged to everyone. Every generation picks an icon it isn't ready to lose, and then spends decades finding reasons not to. Elvis fans did it in gas stations and diners across the American South. Tupac fans did it in liner notes and lyric sheets. Michael Jackson fans do it in frame-by-frame video breakdowns and coffin weight calculations. Because that's simply the tool this generation has been handed. None of it brings anyone back. None of it ever has. But it does something else, something the theorists themselves might not even recognize in the moment. It keeps the artist present tense a little longer. It keeps is instead of was. And for a fan base that grew up on his voice, his moves, his impossible era-defining presence, present tense might just be worth more than the truth. So the next time that ambulance photo crosses your feed, captioned with a question mark, remember what it's really asking. Not where is he, but how do I keep him here? That's not a conspiracy. That's just love, wearing a disguise it never quite learned to take off.